Welcome to Postcards from Barnesville. I'm Pamela Morris, that witchy chick. This is the place where I will share some of the short stories I've written over the years that may otherwise spend their dark lives feeling lonely and unloved. And nobody wants that. Hey there, all you bodies. Welcome to episode 4 of Postcards from Barnesville. It's hard to believe it's June already. It seems like just yesterday we were battling snowstorms, but I'm all for June and the summer. In the early 1980s, I discovered a book of twisted fairy tales called Red as Blood by Tanith Lee. And I had never read anything like this before, and I was immediately in love with the whole concept. That book still lives on my shelves, along with several other Tanith Lee titles. And after that, I always wanted to write one of my own twisted fairy tales. Now, it took me a long time. I didn't do it until 2005, but I finally came up with this one that you're going to hear next. It may not be the best I've ever written, but it is my first, and I'll always love it for that reason. It's one of my longer stories as well, and so it's going to be presented in 2 parts. It's a rather steampunky world into which I have thrust my heroine, Ruby LaBlanc, and she has been tossed out by her wealthy elitist mother, Regina. Ruby is without any proper identification papers, and she's out on the streets that are prowled by the military, who's always looking for vagrants to arrest. Luckily for Ruby, she finds a boarding house that is willing to take her in, and she's going to be sharing that with 7 men and a rather secretive landlady. So enough with this long-winded introduction, because we got a lot of ground to cover. Let's get into part 1 of what I have called Cinnamon and Cyanide. Ruby flipped open the lid, inserted the brass key, and started cranking. 2, 3, 10, 15, 20 revolutions before the mechanism clicked and the monitor flickered to life. A steady hum emitted from the wooden box on the floor as she said a silent prayer and hoped the device would run long enough for her to reach her contact in Syracuse. A soft, reassuring beep sounded as the screen began to glow a sickly green. Propping the device on her lap, Ruby leaned back against the foot of the bed and unfolded the keyboard. Its copper-trimmed key glistened in the light generated by the monitor that faced her and the nearby oil lamp. As her fingers danced over the keys, inputting the needed information codes and passwords, the clock downstairs whirred and chimed 3 times. No wonder she was tired, but it was imperative that she get the e-post sent. If anyone from the Alliance intercepted the data, she'd be tossed in jail no matter who her mother was. Ruby shuddered at the idea. Incarceration wasn't like it had been in the olden days. Back then, you could get your own bed, clean clothes, 3 square meals a day, outdoor recreation, and sometimes even a college education out of the deal. Cruel and unusual treatments were normal now, and political correctness was dead. With a jab, Ruby hit the send button and held her breath. The green light on the face of the box's keyboard blinked twice, and the machine beeped. Transmission sent. Ruby only then realized how much her hands were shaking. Just as quickly as she'd gotten it going, she shut down. Alliance officials were everywhere. The green glow of the monitor at this hour was, as far as they were concerned, an open invitation to break in the door and drag you away. What happened next was in the hands of her contact. Until she heard back from him, Ruby had only to go about her daily life appearing as insignificant as possible. Saul Blackwater rubbed the gritty sands of sleep out of his eyes and focused on the plaster ceiling over his head. He knew every crack and ripple of that old thing. He should. He'd been looking at it every morning and evening for the past 20-some-odd years. Sunlight lanced its way between the slats and around the edges of the window blinds. He needed a hot cup of chicory bad, but first he had to take a leak. On his way, Saul tossed a couple pieces of wood into the stove. Warm embers still glowed deep inside. It shouldn't take long for the fuel to heat things up nicely. In Saul's opinion, the indoor water closet was the best thing that had ever happened to humanity. Even if they weren't quite as fancy as they had been in his grandfather's day, at least they hadn't reverted back to medieval times. Saul didn't bother to close the door. He lived alone. Heaving a resigned sigh, Saul pulled the chain that dangled from the tank hanging on the wall above the rust-stained toilet bowl. A shower would be nice, he mused as he watched the water drain. There wasn't time for that now, though. Saul poured cool water from the china pitcher into the matching bowl, tossed the washcloth into it, and scrubbed his face. What he really needed was coffee. When was the last time he'd had a cup of real coffee? His grandfather had given him some back when it cost only pennies a cup. Saul hadn't liked it much then. By the time he was old enough to buy it, the stuff was so rare he could only afford it for special occasions. Back in the kitchen, and now alert enough not to stumble over the cat that had decided to show itself, Saul was pleased to feel the heat of the stove filling the room. He hated the cold of winter. He tossed another log into the crackling flames beneath the cast-iron surface he used for cooking. Saul filled his dented tea kettle with water from the hand pump and set it to boil. He should check his e-posts. The last transmission from White Dove had said she was close to a breakthrough with the Elmira Anti-Alliance, but he'd not heard from her in nearly a month. That made him edgy. He rubbed his cold hands together. Breakfast first. The thermometer that hung on the porch post just outside his kitchen window read 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Poor chickens, he thought as he pulled on another layer over his t-shirt. He hoped there would be an egg or two for him for breakfast. He may not have agreed a lot with the organics of yesteryear, but they had had one thing right. The grid was dicey. The grid would collapse. Get yourself off the grid if you could. Saul had found an old manual in his grandfather's barn as a kid. The image of solar panels and windmills had fascinated his mechanically inclined brain. Grandpa had quickly hushed the young boy who'd brought that book back to the surface. They want us dependent on them, boy. Grandpa's voice was as clear in Saul's head today as it had been back then. Keep this to yourself, eh? Should have been burned with the others, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The old man had flipped through the pages with affection and loss in his fading eyes before handing it back to Saul. Keep it hidden, safe. Things keep going like they are, and you'll be needing to know these things. Sooner than anyone had truly expected, Saul had needed to know them. He'd made a solar oven which worked great in the summertime. Black pipes ran back and forth across the roof of the house and did a pretty decent job of providing him with hot water most of the year. It meant he had to climb up there in the winter to shovel it off, but it was a nice price for the luxury. A windmill would have been nice, but not practical. It would have drawn too much attention from the Alliance balloon patrols. Puffs of breath billowed from between Saul's lips as he trudged to the chicken coop. In a small barn off to his right, the 2 cows he kept rustled and lowed, slowly. Pigs would want feeding soon, and he knew he'd better get to harvesting the canning the last of his garden vegetables before the snow fell. It was going to be a busy day. The computer and the outside world were going to have to wait. Personal survival came first. Beggars could not be choosers, Ruby had learned at an early age. She couldn't remember her father, whom she apparently was just like. His picture was not even allowed in the house, and if Ruby asked about him, she was told in no uncertain terms to look in the mirror. As a child and in her teens, Ruby had spent a great many hours in front of her dressing table mirror. It wasn't out of vanity, as her mother so often did while she primped and preened and even spoke to herself in the glass, but out of curiosity, searching for her father's face in her own. Her eyes were shaped like wide almonds and brown like a deer's. Unlike Regina, her mother, who had golden tresses that flipped and curled about her face, Ruby's hair was jet black and hung straight as a string. She kept it shoulder length with bangs that just covered her eyebrows. Her mother's tight, thin lips faded beside Ruby's that were full and a rich shade of pink. The only thing they did share was their uncommonly pale skin, white as the finest china doll in her mother's collection. And where her mother was tall and regal, Ruby was never going to be any taller than 5'3" she'd reached when she was 14. There were no fewer than 3 accounts of what had happened to Ruby's father. Her mother claimed he'd gotten in with the wrong crowd, meaning the people who opposed the alliance, and had run off in search of his life to somewhere in Canada. The cook told Ruby that Regina had personally had him arrested and sent out west to one of the numerous re-education camps where, rumor had it, he died. And the chauffeur led Ruby to believe that Mr. LaBlanc had left of his own free will, tired of his wife's constant political and corporate backstabbing as she clawed her way to the rank of state high chancellor. Ruby suspected there were grains of truth in every account, which grains she would likely never know. Apparently, Ruby was just like him whether she wanted to be or not. She never meant to be a rebel. It was just something thrust upon her when nothing else she'd tried to do had proven good enough for her high society mother. After a while, she'd figure she'd never meet Regina's high expectations, so why even try? 3 weeks ago, it had come to a head. Ruby had taken a bigger chance than she'd ever taken before. She joined an anti-alliance march. Her mother had quickly been informed, and the humiliation of the whole affair had left Ruby standing in the streets without a single piece of needed paperwork to her name. Being homeless was not an option. The military police patrolled the streets constantly for stragglers. Curfews were strictly enforced. If you got caught outside after 11 at night and before 5 in the morning, you'd better have the proper documents to prove you weren't a threat to anyone, meaning the government. By some miracle, Ruby had managed to remain in hiding long enough to find Mrs. Lord's boarding house. The landlady had taken pity on Ruby and let her have the last of her 8 available rooms under the stipulation that Ruby help her with all the chores of the place. It seemed a reasonable agreement. Hair brushed and face washed, Ruby stepped into the hallway to the heady aroma of bacon. Bacon? Mrs. Lords must have won big at something to get bacon. Quickening her pace, Ruby thumped down the stairs, then into the kitchen. "Why didn't you wake me to help you?" The scent of bacon tingled the inside of her nose. Her stomach growled and her mouth pooled with saliva. "Is it really bacon?" "Shush now," Mrs. Lord whispered while scooping the still sizzling strips onto a towel-draped plate. "You wake the whole neighborhood." The old woman grinned. "As for why I didn't wake you, everyone deserves a day to sleep in now and then, and you worked hard these past 3 weeks. Besides, if you'd helped me, it wouldn't have been much of a surprise." "Where did you get it?" "I found it. You don't just find bacon, Mrs. L." The matron's softly wrinkled face bloomed into an even greater smile. "Oh, but that's just what happened. It was wrapped in butcher's paper and string right there by the front door, as if someone had slid it through the mail slot." "Do I smell bacon?" A warm, masculine voice cut into the conversation. Ruby and her landlady both turned just as Dr. Tucker lumbered in. His rotund form filled the doorway almost as wide as his white, bearded smile filled the room. "You certainly do," Mrs. Lords replied. "Then we are abundantly blessed this morning." He gave the subject no further attention, making a beeline to the steaming teapot and cups stacked beside it. Ruby watched as he filled his cup and immediately suspected he was the one who'd brought the bacon into the house. All we need now are real eggs and some coffee, and we'll be eating like high society. His blue eyes sparkled over his wire-rimmed glasses, and though he smiled as he looked at Ruby, it made her uncomfortable. Cast out from the ranks for social climbing mother or not, they all knew where Ruby had come from, and somehow she always felt slightly more tolerated than liked by her fellow boarders. Did someone say coffee? The shy voice belonged to Mr. Bronson, a sheepish-looking man who peered at the world from behind thick black frames. As he entered, he dropped a heavy canvas book bag on the floor by the door. He scanned the room expectantly, then spied the heaping plate of bacon Mrs. Lords was just putting on the kitchen table. "Is that bacon?" "Yes, it is." The next 5 minutes echoed the previous as each newly arrived tenant entered the room. Each speculated the bacon's origins. The old and stodgy Mr. Martin instantly assumed it was a case of entrapment. Government agents must have put it there, and would, no doubt, come pounding on the door any minute and arrest them all for possession of illegal contraband. Mr. Thomas always waddled into a room with a smile that made you think he was up to something. This morning was no exception. It was impossible for Ruby to tell if the grin was because he'd been enticed by the bacony goodness his nose had detected, or if he were in on some great secret as to its origin. Mr. Walters stumbled in. His bloodshot eyes appeared piggish through thick glasses. Tall and rail-thin, he folded himself into his usual chair at the table, looking slightly hungover. He told everyone he'd been clean for years, but the drugs and alcohol had taken a toll on his body. "Damn, that smells good." He eyed the plate as if it were a heap of the finest dope. As always, they heard Mr. Reynolds before they saw him. He stomped, coughed, sneezed, wheezed, and hacked his way down the stairs, then stopped at the doorway and stared, hanky poised and ready for the use in one hand. "What's that smell?" he grimaced. "Bacon." His already twisted expression grew even more so. "Real bacon, like from a pig?" "Here it comes," Mr. Martin grumbled under his breath. "Yes, from a pig," Mrs. Lord said with an almost forced edge of cheer in her voice. She'd been very testy lately, Ruby thought. Reynolds grunted and made his way out of the chair. "Doesn't agree with my stomach. Gives me gas," he said. He coughed into his handkerchief as if to emphasize his point. "All the more for the rest of us, then." Mr. Thomas's face beamed at the thought. Ruby looked around the table and at its occupants. Sure enough, there was still one place empty. "Where's Mr. Arnold?" She really didn't have to ask, but felt she should. "Probably still sleeping," Mr. Tucker replied. "I heard him up and about until almost 3:30 this morning." "Should we wait for him?" "Hell no," Martin protested. "If he can't get his lazy ass out of bed—" "Mr. Martin, language, please," Dr. Tucker interrupted. The old man glared at the doctor, crossed his arms, and frowned. "We're going to yap about this bacon business all day or eat it before it gets cold. I'm hungry." "We're going to eat it," Mrs. Arnold chirped. "Ruby, help me serve, won't you?" You are listening to Cinnamon and Cyanide by Pamela Morris. If you're enjoying this tale and would like more, visit my website, PamelaMorrisBooks.com, for a full selection of my available novels and collections, including my debut collection of twisted fairy tales, Not Your Grandma's Fairy Tales, published by Ardent Creations in 2022. There is a link in the description below. And now, let's get back to part 2 of our story. With a cup of herbal tea, Saul headed over to what appeared to be nothing more than an old treadle sewing machine. The plain wooden case on top had housed such a thing once. As he'd done with so many other things, Saul had adapted this device to better suit his needs. Every now and then the urge to surrender invaded Saul's mind. Life could be so much easier if he just did as OWA, One World Alliance, wanted. He'd been a wealthy and powerful businessman once with everything the Alliance promised at his fingertips. Follow the rules and all would be well. Instead of ending the day with dirt crammed under his fingernails and his back bent in pain from hauling wood or bending over crops, he could be living the high life, drinking real coffee instead of what amounted to a cup of leaves and twigs. Saul stared at the sewing machine box and released the doubts he'd been holding with his breath. No, he was doing the right thing. He would continue to do it regardless of the price he'd pay. Saul was in too deep to turn back now. Beneath the wooden cover, a flat-screen monitor awaited the spark of life. A drawer at the front of the cabinet pulled out. Where wooden pegs had once held spools of colorful threads and bobbins, now rested a cobbled-together keyboard. The local dump never disappointed. Saul could not have been more pleased the day he'd hauled a manual typewriter back into the light of day. Though caked with dirt and grime, every black key was perfectly intact. The cast-iron wheel, treadle, and belt no longer moved a threaded needle, but hooked to a small generator. Once the wheel was going and Saul was firmly in the rhythm of the device, he had no trouble powering it for an hour or more. It was plenty of time to read and send his e-posts. People bragged about their portables, but the crank time was simply too short to be of use to Saul. Luckily, OWA hadn't mastered the art of scrambling basic wireless waves yet. Soon he logged into his account and was scrolling through the messages. There was a couple of very high priority sent by the upper crust of the anti-alliance, but none caught his eye faster than the sight of the screen name Little Dove. He'd feared the worst for the girl. The nearly month-long silence that had followed her insistence that she was going to join the march in Elmira had been agonizing. She was a sharp, bright young thing and a huge asset to the cause. Saul double-clicked to open the message. RLB 1324, the first line read. It verified the writer and sender of the message was who it claimed to be. Dismissed by Regina, it continued. Saul felt himself blanch and almost lost connection as his feet slowed. Living on own, Woodland Drive boarding house, room and board for work, 7 others here. Several seem warm to the idea of anti-alliance. Need to make sure before I approach. Still need proper papers. Mrs. Lord's landlady, doing best to get for me. Await word on how to proceed. RLB 1324. The screen dimmed, flickered, then blinked out entirely. Saul's chest constricted until a pathetic no wheezed helplessly out. Dr. Tucker, his paper bag lunch clutched in one hand, was the first to leave. He'd spent the day at the free clinic. Mr. Thomas had somehow convinced Mr. Martin to quit looking on the dark side of life all the time and join him for a game of checkers or two at the nearest community center. Begrudgingly, Mr. Martin had gone, but had whispered a paranoid, "Watch yourself," to Ruby before leaving. In his tweed jacket, black trousers, and black tweed waistcoat, Mr. Bronson had donned his best bowler and said his good days as he headed out to the library where he worked. Ruby wasn't exactly sure what he did there all day, as there were so few books left. Mr. Reynolds packed the pocket of his greatcoat with no fewer than 3 handkerchiefs before adding a scarf, gloves, and a hat to his attire. He'd stop at the chemist's shop 1 street over first to see what new pharmaceuticals may have arrived overnight. Then he'd make his way to all the others in town. Ruby wondered what exactly it was he did for a living. She suspected it had something to do was black market sale of homeopathic remedies. Mr. Walters worked at the men's shelter and was a part-time counselor to others who suffered from the alcohol and drug addictions he'd overcome. It didn't seem wise to Ruby to have a man of his issues residing with someone like Mr. Reynolds, but of course, Ruby could be completely wrong about all of it. Mr. Reynolds was still sleeping. He'd sleep until well past noon, then come stumbling downstairs, bleary-eyed and groggy. He worked third shift at the nearby salt mine. Eventually, it was just Ruby and Mrs. Lords, and the landlady was not going to stay long herself. "I'm off to the fishmonger's," she said, heaving her generous body to standing. "You'll be all right on your own, won't you?" Mrs. Lords left Ruby alone whenever she went to the market. Without the proper papers, neither dared let her stray too far from the front stoop. "You know I will. There's plenty here to do." She scanned the remnants of breakfast on the table. The kitchen counters and stove behind her were in an equal state of disarray. "Good. And," Mrs. Lords dug into her purse, "take this." It was a $20 bill. "Get whatever you can from the fruit and vegetable vendor. She should be by today. I thought an apple pie might be nice for dessert tonight, so get some apples." Once her cloak was on, the landlady tied a scarf over her graying hair and headed for the door, basket in one hand, pocketbook in the other. Out of habit, Ruby followed her to the door. Mrs. Lords paused as she stepped out into the brisk autumn air, then turned and looked at Ruby. "And don't let anyone in but our own," she warned. "I never do." And she was gone. Down the cracked and worn brownstone steps she went, left towards town and the marketplace by the Chemung River. Ruby watched until Mrs. Lords's form was a little more than a speck, and the cold wind drove deep into Ruby's bones. Winter was surely almost here. She'd not be surprised at all to see snow on the ground one of these mornings. Ruby went back inside to stoke the stove and begin her cleaning journeys. Mrs. Lords waddled her way into town as quickly as her arthritic legs would take her. The best fish of the morning would be snatched up all too quickly, and with the extra money she'd soon be getting, she could surely buy something extra special for her boarders. The idea of having to make even one extra stop was not at all to her liking. Mirror, Mirror wasn't the sort of place she normally would have entered, but today she was waiting anxiously outside the door when the young clerk flipped over the sign and gave her a nasty glare. She went in anyway, trying to pretend she didn't notice how neatly groomed he was compared to her hand-me-down attire. His suit was spotless, his hair was trimmed, his mustache properly waxed and curled along the edges. On his narrow nose, which directed his gaze downward at Mrs. Lords, rested a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. He cleared his throat with annoyance before speaking. "May I help you?" Mrs. Lords straightened her back as best she could. There was nothing to be ashamed about. She was here on official business. "I would like to see your best mirror, sir." He scanned her homespun clothing with distaste. "Our best?" "Your very best, if you please," Mrs. Lords continued. "One fit for a queen?" His eyes brightened. "Ah, I know exactly what you're looking for. Follow me." Saul sat paralyzed with fear. Should he reply to the e-post? Should he contact those nearest to Little Dove and pray they weren't stopped at the door, or sooner, before they could reach her? Maybe he should go to Elmira himself. Though the slowest method, he had to do something to warn his young contact. Saul pumped the computer back to life and typed as quickly as his old fingers would allow. It certainly didn't look like liquid gold, but Ruby knew the bacon grease could be sold for a hefty price on the black market. Mrs. Lords wanted to save it for the boarding house, though. Ruby scraped it into a small glass jar, twisted the cap into place, and set it aside. The cast-iron pan Mrs. Lord had used to fry the delicacy was the last thing to be scrubbed, and Ruby was just heaving it on top of the stove to dry when she heard a female voice shouting in the distance. Fresh veggies, fresh fruit. Fresh veggies, fresh fruit. Pumpkins, tomatoes, apples and pears. Get your onions, potatoes, parsnips, turnips and carrots here. Fresh veggies, fresh fruit. The banter would repeat itself up one street and down the next until all the goods were gone. Ruby fetched the money the landlady had given her and a basket from atop the cupboard, pulled on a heavy sweater, and went to the curb to wait. Fresh veggies, fresh fruit, the old woman called. Now that Ruby was outside, the voice was much clearer and distinctly different from the one she knew so well in the past. Someone new must have taken over the route. As the mule-drawn wagon of goods got closer, Ruby stepped out and gave a wave. "Good morning," Ruby said with cheer. "Morning, miss. What would you like?" The cart owner was hunched and shuffled as she walked to the side of the wagon. "My landlady would like some apples for a pie," Ruby told her, then asked, "What has become of the other vendor?" "Fell ill, I'm told." The woman made her way to the back of the cart. "Apples for a pie, you say? You want something sweet then and crisp." Ruby nodded, watching as the woman's gnarled hands passed over and dismissed numerous apples that looked perfectly fine to her customer. Ruby scanned the other fruits and vegetables. What else should she get? The vendor placed half a dozen large apples into Ruby's waiting basket, setting them in as delicately as if they were eggs. "Anything else, dear?" 9 potatoes and 5 carrots. 2. With the weather turning cold, Mrs. Lords would want to be making more stews. "And an onion. No, 2 onions." Peddler grinned. "You're my best customer this morning," she chirped as she selected the items. "That be all?" Ruby nodded, waiting for the woman to tabulate the cost, and took the change. "Thank you," she said, and took back the laden basket. "Thank you." The old vendor was just about to gather up the lead reins of her patient meal when she paused. "Wait a minute, miss," she said. "Is something wrong?" No. The saleswoman made her way back to the apple crate and dug around in it so much Ruby half expected the whole lot to tumble out and go rolling down the street. With a gasp of delight, the gnarled hand pulled out a huge golden yellow apple, the likes of which Ruby had never seen. "There she is. What a beauty." "It's wonderful." "It's yours." "Mine? Oh, I can't. No." Ruby drew back. "A present for the prettiest customer on the route." I just can't take it. Let me pay." But the woman was persistent. "It's for you, free and clear, from my very own orchard. Don't tell the precinct police now, will you?" She pushed the apple firmly into Ruby's hand. "I won't tell," she promised. A toothless grin spread over the peddler's face. "Good. Now it's just for you to make a fine little tart with, understand? Our little secret?" Speechless, Ruby gave a slight nod and watched as the fruit cart was set back into motion with the flick of the mule's reins and a soft whistle from the vendor's aged lips. "Fresh veggies, fresh fruit. Fresh veggies, fresh fruit." The call began again as the wagon creaked slowly around the next corner. You have just listened to Postcards from Barnesville with Pamela Morris, That Witchy Chick. A place for free short stories that otherwise may have spent their dark lives lonely and unloved. Please subscribe and hit that like button if you enjoyed this reading and to keep the stories coming. Be sure to check your mailbox for another postcard from Barnesville from That Witchy Chick soon. And thank you for listening.